week 4 of Brighter. My name's Jenny Taylor, and I'm here with my friend Nick Harding. And we're really glad that you could come back and join us again for another session. So if you remember, we've been looking at these 3 habits to help us shine brighter. We're wanting to become confident in telling our own stories. We want to become confident in talking about Jesus and confident to invite people into a church event, some invitational event. And that is what we're going to look at today. So you'll have seen in your booklets that we are once again looking at the disciple maker's journey, which is actually in this session, but we've looked at it a couple of times before because we've talked about the different parts of it. We've talked about connecting with people, we've talked about chatting with people, and we are finally on to inviting people. So in this section, what we want to talk about when we do invitations is recognizing that there are probably 2 types of invitations that we have for people. An invitation to a social event like a barbecue or cup of coffee, go to the pub, go to the cinema. And then there are also some invitations that have a spiritual element, that invitation to a spiritual journey.
So something like a church event, like a Christmas or Easter service or Alpha course or Christianity Explored course, something like that?
Something like that. Something that involves us talking to them about Jesus in that event. So we have these 2 types of event, and we need to become much more confident in not just inviting people to those social events, although I still think you should because people like those, but also recognizing that we have these opportunities to invite people into spiritual journeys. Now, I don't know about you, Nick, but I actually really like being invited to things. Okay, I do, because I think actually invitations are great. Sometimes I think we get a bit worried.
We get quite hung up, don't we, that we're being imposing something in some way.
Yeah, or that they're going to, what if they say no, won't it be difficult? But actually, if you're the person receiving the invitation, I think you're more likely to be anxious about having to say no, aren't you? Knowing that that person's inviting you into their life, into something that's important to them, and then you're having to decline for whatever reason. Actually, most of the time, most people's invitations end in a yes. Yeah, they do, because, well, who doesn't want to be invited into something that's good? The assumption most of us make if we're being invited to something is that you're only inviting me because it's good and because you'd like to do that with me.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think, Nick, didn't you have an unexpected opportunity to invite somebody somewhere?
Yes, I did.
In a sofa shop?
It was in a sofa shop, Quite an unlikely space where Jenny and I just went. We were looking for sofas, and we got into the shop, and this young assistant was very friendly, very helpful, asking us what we looked for and pointing us in the right direction. And we kept on bumping into her around the shop. It's quite a big shop. And so it felt like we just got a little bit more friendly with her each point around the shop where we bumped into her again. And obviously she was still trying to sell us a sofa, which is fine. But as she went round, it became clear that she was actually kind of keen just to talk. Couldn't really figure out why, but she wasn't in a rush to move on. And we got to the end of all the way around the store, back at the beginning, and we were just, again, chatting with her. And, it's one of those opportunities where you just feel like there's a moment here to ask her about herself. And so just said, thanks for all your help. You've been really great. What's it like working here? And she just said, well, actually, if truth be known, I really don't like working here. And, I'm looking for another job and I'm really unhappy here. In fact, my life's a bit unhappy at the moment. So, she really opened up quite vulnerably in a very short space of time. So I think I said something like, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Well, I'll tell you what, we'll pray that God gives you another job. So that was the first introduction of anything of a spiritual nature. But it's kind of, when you're in a shop, you've got nothing to lose. So, just go for it. Just go for it. So she said, oh, thank you. That's really kind. And which again was, I was surprised. And then as we're leaving the shop, she kind of sidles up to us as we're walking towards the door and says, oh, do you go to a church? So I said, yes, we do actually. She said, oh, that's really interesting. So I said, is that something, that you've experienced? She said, I have experienced that before. And I just thought, well, we've got an Easter service coming up in 2 weeks' time, golden opportunity to invite them. So before we left the shop, I said, I'll tell you what, we've got an Easter service. Would you like to come? She said, much to my surprise, yes, I would. So I thought, okay, well, fantastic, that's great. I told her where it was, and off we went. And I thought, well, most of those invitations don't lead to someone actually turning up.
No, they don't. No.
You know, they say they're going to come, and often they don't. But I went back a week later with the sort of printed invitation, and she wasn't actually in work that day, but I gave it to one of the staff. I said, could you pass this on to the young woman who had spoken to us? And I think she did. And lo and behold, Easter Sunday comes, there she is in church. Amazing. And she sits next to us, she enjoys the service. There's a gospel appeal, you know, put your hands up if you want to know more about or follow Jesus. Her hand goes straight up.
Wow.
So I thought, okay, that was really unexpected, an unexpected opportunity and an unexpected result. I have to say, they don't all end up like that, obviously, but that was just reminding me of the power of invitation and the importance of taking every opportunity, because you just don't know when someone's going to say yes, you don't know when they're going to show up, and you don't know if they're going to open their hearts to become a follower of Jesus.
Yeah, no, I think you're quite right. That is, whilst that is an amazing story, that isn't what always happens, is it, when we invite people places. And I think for lots of us, part of the issue is that when we have previously invited people to church, it maybe hasn't worked out the way that we thought it was going to, whether that's because somebody has said no and they've rejected our invitation, or we've invited them to something and it maybe wasn't quite the way we'd hoped it would be, or they've not understood something about the service, or, you know, worst case scenario, somebody in our church community horribly embarrasses us and we you know, we don't know where to put ourselves and what to do next. Has that something like that ever happened with you, to you?
Well, I do get embarrassed sometimes, you know, because the conversation doesn't always go how you'd hope it would. There's a lovely couple who run a coffee shop near us, coffee shops again.
Yeah.
And you know, I've got to know this couple over the last couple of years, and the wife had brought her child to our parent and toddler group in church on a couple of occasions. So I knew she knew where we were, and I knew she'd actually turned up to a church service on one Sunday, although I didn't see her there, didn't know she'd been. But she said, "Oh, I came last Sunday." So I thought, "Oh, that's amazing." And you know, everything about them screams people of peace. You know, leaning in, asking questions, and the husband's always saying, "Oh yes," and he always initiates the conversation with me about God stuff. You know, when I say, "Oh, I'm going to pray for you," "Oh yes, please pray for me, Nick." So definitely people of peace, definitely people who seem to want to say yes. And I thought, well, we're about to start an Alpha course. This is I can't think of a better opportunity to invite them. And so I do. I invite them, give them the invitation card, follow it up with a text message. And there's this kind of awkward moment where it's clear they're not jumping at the opportunity, but they don't quite want to say no. And
I recognise that feeling.
And I'm not totally sure whether they're just kind of busy and haven't responded, or whether they're trying to fob me off. So I kind of just push a little bit further and say, look, you know, not trying to hassle you or anything, but if you'd like us to pick you up, to bring you to the Alpha course, really happy to do that. And eventually they come back and say, actually, Nick, we're not ready. You know, we're definitely not going to come to the Alpha course. And it doesn't sound like a big deal, but after 2 years of investing in relationship, I felt very awkward, and I kind of was worried that would, I was embarrassed, and I was worried that I'd somehow jeopardize the relationship. So I felt quite embarrassed at that moment, in the no moment. But the good thing is, back in the coffee shop, absolutely normal.
It's just
everything's fine. So all my fears were unfounded. My embarrassment was unnecessary. But yes, definitely do get embarrassed sometimes.
Yeah, and I think that your story really illustrates, I guess, what is true is that because actually people do value being invited, and that you want to include them in something that's important to you, that those relationships can stand that, can't they? They can it's okay for somebody to say, no, I don't want to come. And that doesn't mean, while it might be the end of the conversation at that point, it doesn't necessarily mean that you would never invite them to anything ever again.
Of course not.
Of course not. No, it doesn't, does it? So I think we have to realise, don't we, that whilst we have those fears about inviting people, we actually do all know somebody like this couple from the coffee shop, don't we, who we're connected to, whose life we know would be wonderfully changed for the better by them coming to know Jesus. And we have to be courageous enough to step out that little leap of faith and invite them and see what happens.
Absolutely.
So what we're going to do next is just take a couple of minutes for you to be thinking about what it is about inviting people to church that makes that difficult for you. What are the barriers that you face, and how might you go about mitigating those, doing something different? What courage might you need to start inviting people to church events? Hopefully you found it helpful thinking about why you might find it difficult to invite people to events at your church. But one of the things we want to think about is why people say yes in the first place. Why do people say yes when we invite them? Well, usually it's actually because they quite like you. You know, when we're invited someplace by a person that we know cares about us, that's a good friend to us, we are much more likely to say yes. And when we're talking about inviting people into things that are part of a spiritual journey, like, you know, an invitation service or something like that, there's a really great opportunity for us there to introduce the person that we've made a connection with to other people within our church community. I think, Nick, last week you talked a little bit about this, didn't you? About the great thing about having more than one person investing in someone's life, isn't it? It's a great way for people to find that space of community and belonging. And I think over the last few decades, probably, we've started to see a bit of a change in the way that people approach going on a spiritual journey and learning about Jesus. So it used to be that you would share the gospel with somebody, they would believe in the gospel, and they'd change their behaviour, wouldn't they? And they'd feel like they had this sense of belonging, being part of the community. So we think about that as believe, behave, and then you belong. But that's not really true anymore. I think it looks much more like people are drawn into faith journeys because they're looking for spaces to belong.
Can I give you an example of that?
Yeah, sure.
So there was a young woman who was a friend of someone else in our community, our missional community, met her at work, got invited into our community, very quickly came on an Alpha course. At some point along the way, we're still not quite sure where, she gave her life to Jesus. But what she said as she, very early on in the Alpha course was, it wasn't like, oh yes, now I found the truth that the Bible tells me, all that Jesus is, etc. The first thing she said that really indicated God was at work was, I finally found the place I belong.
Yeah.
She'd found this sense of family and community, of being loved and being welcomed, long before she ever really understood what she was about to put her trust in.
Yeah. So she's done that the other way around, hasn't she? She's belonged first, hasn't she? And then she's believed in Jesus. And then she's then on that journey, isn't she, to her life looking more and more like Christ.
Exactly.
And I think that's something really amazing that as Christian communities we have to offer. We live in a society where there are so many people who are disenfranchised, who are lonely, who need community. And we have it, don't we? We have
in spades.
Yeah. And we're really good at that bit. So when we have these opportunities for invitation, we can be inviting people to be part of that. I think, like you, my own small group has currently we have a similar situation where we have somebody who's a friend of a friend, as a neighbour, in fact, of one of the people in our community, who has started coming along. But they come to Bible studies, they come to social things, they've been at worship nights. They haven't yet made a decision to follow Jesus, but they come because they count it as a place of belonging, because they know that they are loved there and cared about. And we keep trusting and praying that as we give them opportunities, that they will come to know Jesus for themselves.
It's amazing, isn't it? And I love the way Jesus modeled that unconditional love and acceptance for people who came to him. And there's a great story about invitations in the Gospels. It's John chapter 4, and it's the story of the woman at the well. Familiar to many people. Jesus arrives, it's the middle of the day, there's no one else about, nobody in their right mind would be out in the middle of the day in Israel. It would be burning hot. Definitely too hot. And he's there at the well, and this other woman is there. And first of all, he's a Jew, she's a Samaritan. He's a man, she's a woman. Why would a woman be out in the middle of the day? Perhaps because she's been ostracized by her community, and they meet at the well. And so Jesus engages her in conversation, cuts across all the cultural boundaries, invites her effectively into a relationship, and starts to talk to her about her life. And soon enough, he starts to tell her stuff about her that she doesn't know, or that other people don't know. She knows, but other people don't know. And so she's absolutely amazed when Jesus says, you've had all these men in your life, and the person you're with at the moment isn't your husband. And she realizes that she's speaking to a prophet. And so she runs back to the village, and she says, guess what? I've met a man who's told me all about my life. And so after Jesus invites her into a relationship with himself by engaging in this really cross-cultural, breaking the ground kind of conversation, she runs back and she invites her friends to come back to the well to come and meet Jesus. And so the whole village effectively turns out. They get an invitation to meet with Jesus. And, we don't know what the end of that story was, but I kind of like to imagine like a whole bunch of disciples were formed out of those Samaritans who encountered Jesus because they were invited. They were invited. So, it doesn't really matter who does the inviting. What's important is that we get over ourselves and invite people so that they also can come and meet with Jesus. Now, I think there's lots of things that as communities, she had to overcome all sorts of barriers, but for most of us, inviting people into our community is not a difficult thing to do.
No.
Because, we know people well, they're good friends, hopefully they're good fun, and we do stuff that people can join in relatively easily. But it's really good to be able to make those invitations to our community so people can get that flavor of what the family of God's about because of that need to belong. They get a sense of, well, I don't know what I'm quite getting myself into here, but I know this is a place where I could be at home, I could be myself, I could belong, and maybe I could start to discover some stuff that actually is really important for my life. So we're going to take a bit of a break, and we're going to look at what are some of the ways that as a community we could make it easier for people to be invited to join with us. Hi, I hope that exercise was helpful. And, I'm just trusting that you're going to go on many, many brilliant adventures with this training and the new confidence you're gaining. And we'd like to just share 10 top tips for your invitations to be more effective and more successful and more fun. So we're going to start with number one. Jen, what's number one?
Number one is to be friendly. It's a really easy one.
It's not rocket science, is it?
Smile when you give your invitations. And I guess, try and relax. You really want to be yourself because you're inviting somebody to something that you want to go to because it's good, isn't it? Not
Absolutely.
because you're inviting them to be part of something good. So be friendly, be joyful with it, smile, and, draw people in with your wonderful personality.
Very good.
Okay. Number two?
Number two is explain what you're inviting them to. It sounds like an obvious thing to do, but for example, if it's a church event and it's in the church building, we're familiar with it. It's like normal for us. We're there every week, and we don't think that for someone coming in from outside who's never been before, it's a very scary thing to come to. Or if it's an alpha course, well, what's an alpha course and what does that look like, and who's going to be there and where's it going to, et cetera, et cetera. So explain as much as you can to make people feel at ease. If you're inviting them to a church service and you have an online service, then say, well, check us out online. In fact, a lot of people would want to do that, to say, well, what does this place look like? How many people are going to be there? What's the music? And does everybody get to sing? All sorts of questions that people are asking. So it's good to really explain everything that people can expect. Great. What about number three, Jen?
So number three really, I think, is about having personal invitations. So where you can, invite somebody in person rather than using technology to do that. Like we get so much information, don't we, as individuals, emails, messages, social media, etc. So I think in order for our invitations to stand out, then we want them to be in person. It really lets somebody know that you care about them being there with you when you bother to take the time to speak to them in person, to invite them to come and do something with you.
And the last thing you want them to feel is like they're just part of a marketing campaign.
Yeah. And I think, when you get invited to loads of things, that's exactly how that feels. It's just part of somebody else's big idea. So, having a personal invitation, I think, really, really helps. I mean, feel free to follow it up, obviously, with a text message or whatever. But I think the initial invitation, you want to do in person because it'll mean a lot more.
So number 4, Jen, this was a game changer for me, is seeing refusal as success. In other words, when someone says no to your invitation, rather than taking it personally, oh no, they've said no. Well, some people will say no.
Yeah.
But what's important is this: we have done our job, our part. The rest is up to God. So why do we put pressure on ourselves and only see a yes, I'll come, as a success? When we've done our part, when we've invited someone, we can see that as success, irrespective of whether they say yes or whether they say no. And I think that takes all the pressure off us. Yeah,
I completely agree. And I guess because what we're trying to do is to be confident about giving invitations, isn't it? So of course it can definitely be a success every time because you've invited somebody. That's wonderful.
And of course you can invite them again another time.
Yeah, more opportunities keep coming, don't they?
Yeah.
All right, well, number 5 is, I suppose, is a bit linked to that, and it is about praying. Praying about who you should invite to an event. So if, for example, you have a Christmas service, an Easter service, some special service happening in your church, or maybe within your small group you're doing something together, actually taking the time to pray and ask God, who should I invite to this? Who, where's God already at work? Where's he already, where's that seed already been planted that you get to come along and do a little bit of watering?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think that's really important. And I think even if you pray and God gives you somebody to ask and you ask them and they say no, that's fine. Go and ask again. Okay, Lord, they've said no. Who else?
Yeah.
Who else could I invite?
Yeah. And the beauty of sensing God leading us in a particular direction to invite someone is that we have more faith for that person because we think this is what God's asking us to do. So that's great. Another thing, the next point is also about prayer, which is about once we've thought about who we want to invite, to pray for that person every single day. To pray for them, pray for their heart to be open, pray for them to want to come, pray for them to feel at ease, pray for them to give a yes, and then to turn up. Prayer is incredibly powerful, Jen.
It is.
And I love that verse in the Amplified version of James 5:16, which says, the earnest, heartfelt, continued prayer, persistent and regular, continued prayer makes tremendous power available, dynamic in its working. So let's trust in the power of prayer and keep praying for those God's put on our hearts.
Yeah, amazing. So number 7 is to practice your invitation. And that really just means practice the words that you're actually going to say so that you're confident about the invitation you're gonna give and you don't fall over your words last minute. So I think it's a bit like approaching it like you would do if you were going to invite somebody out on a date, if you can remember the last time you did that. You will have thought about the words beforehand. You'll have figured out, okay, now I want to say this and I want to say that. So having a bit of practice, I think, really helps to build our confidence in giving a good invitation.
Yeah, that's great, Jen. And the next point is not just to have that confidence because we've practiced, but also to be willing to go with the person if they say yes. There's many people will say yes and then on the day don't show.
They don't show up.
I'm sure you've had that experience where you've invited someone to something, they've said yes, and you've hung around at the door, waited for them for ages, they don't show. If you offer to go with them, to say, that's great, oh, that's fantastic, I'll so enjoy going with you to whatever it is, and then say, I'll tell you what, I'll pick you up a quarter of an hour beforehand, or I'll knock on your door and we can walk together. Or even if you can't do that, you can say, well, I'll meet you outside at the gate, at the end of the path, the bottom of the road. because what you're doing is you're giving them confidence that they won't be on their own when they walk in to this building where they've never been before. They have no idea who'll be there or what it will be like. They know that you will be there and they won't have to go hunting for you, feeling insecure and uncertain. So go with the person if you possibly can.
Yeah, I think that's a really good one, Nick, because sometimes I think we forget how difficult it is to walk into something like a church building, because we do it all the time, forgetting that for somebody who's new, that's just a crowd full of people that you don't know. And most of us feel quite anxious about that, don't we? So having someone to come with you is brilliant, isn't it? Okay, so number 9 would be about what we do when they arrive, and that is about introducing them to other people. You know, we've talked before about how good it is to have this community that people can belong to. So when we do have new people that join us because we've invited them, we want to connect them with other people within our church community who we think they'll get on with. Whether that's because you think their personalities will go together well, or because they've got similar interests. But you want to be connecting them to the people in your community who are fun.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Connect them with the fun people. Connect them with people who are encouraging, people that will make them feel really, really welcomed.
Brilliant. Love that, Jen. Final point 10 is this. Top 10 tips. Number 10 is once you've invited them to something, consider inviting them to other things. So they can, as you say, meet more of your friends. They can start to get that sense of belonging. I think of a woman who lives on our street who a couple from our missional community bumped into as they were prayer walking around. They got into conversation. They started connecting, then chatting. Quickly, the conversation turned spiritual, and they offered to pray for her on the street. The result of that was she ended up coming. They invited her to a Sunday service. She came to a Sunday service. God really touched her life. The result of that was we were able to invite her to an Alpha course in our home, and she came to as many as she could. And these multiple invitations have started to connect her with a really wide group of people and different aspects of the life of the church. And that too is very powerful. So those are our top 10 tips. So I hope those top 10 tips were useful to you. As you know, Jen, many of these points are taken from Michael Harvey's book on creating a culture of invitation in church. Recommend that book for those of you who'd like to dig into this a little bit more. So we've been talking here at the invitation stage on the disciple maker's journey, moving from a sort of social connection or social invitation to some kind of spiritual journey where they start to engage with a spiritual topic of some sort, whether it's church service or Alpha course, whatever it might be. And it's important to recognize that it doesn't have to follow this pattern. People will jump on the disciple maker's journey at any point. It's not a nice, neat set of stepping stones. In fact, it's more like a series of sort of landmarks along the way to help us get our bearings. Where are we in our relationship with this person? Where are they on their journey? But this invitation stage is a really important one because it's where they can make that journey to become a spiritual journey for themselves, not just a friendship with us. And there's a friend that comes to mind who I met very early on in my medical career. In fact, I just started in general practice, and I went to his engraving company to get a nameplate engraved for my general practice surgery.
Your office, yeah, okay.
And he happened to be near the counter. He's a small business, about a dozen people, and he was a little bit interested because I was asking for a red Perspex nameplate rather than the brass plate, which most doctors would have had. That's the normal thing. So he comes over and we get chatting a bit, and we seem to get on quite well. His name's Nick, my name's Nick, and we leave it. I go away. I come back to pick up the plate. It's great. It's just what I wanted. He's there again, and again we just get chatting, and he discovers I've got this thing that I do with church and what have you. And because he's really friendly, I just think, well, why not? Let's see if he wants to go for a coffee. So I say to him, hey, do you fancy a coffee sometime? And to my surprise, he says yes. So we end up going to a local coffee shop a couple of weeks later, get on really well, lots of fun chat, interesting conversation, some spiritual stuff. And he says, I'd love you to meet my wife. And I said, well, why don't we get together as two couples? So we have a meal together as two couples. This is mainly still in the area of sort of social invitation. But we have this meal together, and again, the conversation becomes spiritual, and we take our courage in our hands and say, would you like to do some Bible study with us? So this is an invitation to a spiritual journey, a 4-week Bible study course that will help them understand the Christian faith. And without going into a long, drawn-out saga of how the story went, it was very exciting. First time we'd ever done anything like that. They both end up becoming Christians because not only do we invite them to this Bible study, but we then invite them to an evangelistic event taking place in the city.
Right, okay.
And at that event, they take the plunge and become Christians. And they've been lifelong friends for the last 40 years. So, they were, and not only that, but he then went on to share his faith, to be brighter in his workplace. Instead of being the grumpy boss, he became the boss that likes to care and share. And at least 2 other of his employees also came to faith. So he, in fact, if you look at the disciple maker's journey, he went on to become the multiplier in the final stage of the journey.
Yeah.
But it was all around that movement from social contact, social invitation to spiritual journey that allowed him to progress on this journey towards faith in Christ.
I think it's interesting, isn't it, that process that you obviously have put together, that you'd unintentionally put together, you and Jenny, as you'd met with this couple, and that you hadn't followed, even the story you just told doesn't follow that linear process, did you? You were still having social events, weren't you, in between the spiritual ones? You were still having natural conversations along with spiritual conversations, and that's all happening almost at the same time, isn't it? So what did you have to think about, though, in order to be able to sort of help that couple to move forwards in their journey?
There's something right at the centre of the disciple maker's journey, Jen, which we call it the "What's next, Lord?" question. So I didn't have this language for what we were doing at that time. It was kind of instinctive. But at each stage, we just say, I wonder what we should do next with this couple. And God would pop something into our heads. Okay, let's do that.
We'll do that.
Yeah. Let's go out for a coffee. Let's go for a meal. Let's go to a film. Let's do a Bible study. So asking that question allowed us to keep moving on this journey, this process of helping someone discover faith in Christ. And that disciple maker's journey is language that I would put to it now that I didn't have then. Moving from, connecting, where we're just being friendly, saying, hi, how are you doing? Seeing whether a conversation takes place, moving to chatting, seeing if they want to engage in conversation, moving from natural conversation about the weather or the traffic or the price of sliced bread, whatever it might be, to a spiritual conversation, which is where we look to try and share our story, if there's an opportunity to do that, and then talk about Jesus if the opportunity arises. So in that sort of moving from connecting to chatting, and then as people are showing an interest, they're obviously people of peace, we're thinking, well, I wonder if I could invite them to something. Could I invite them first out for a pint, invite them to our home for a meal, invite them to the footy, or could I even invite them to something at church or an Alpha or Christianity Explored course that would allow them to very deliberately engage in this process and go on this journey towards faith in Christ?
Oh, that's amazing, Nick, isn't it? That we get to be part of those journeys, don't we, with other people? Yeah, that's great. So I do hope that as people have gone through the Brighter course with us, that they have really been able to grasp hold of that confidence, that real confidence to be able to tell your own story, to talk to other people about the difference Jesus has made in you, to be able to share the gospel well, talk about Jesus' story, his story here on the world, whether you use the 4 points or not, but having the confidence to do so and having the confidence to invite people onto a spiritual journey, to be able to develop that as a rhythm. And I think, right at the very beginning in week 1, we talked about how important it was to be intentional, to prayerfully asking God, who should I be talking to? Who should I invite? As you said, what's next, Lord, isn't it? All the way through that process. And I do hope that means that, as we leave you with this, that you are really encouraged that this is something you can do, that everybody can be part of being brighter, shining brighter, letting their light shine in the places that they live, learn, work and play.
Yeah. So I've got a final thing to say, Jen.
Go on.
And it's what will translate this course into meaningful, enjoyable, and a fruitful lifestyle of being the light wherever Jesus sends us. Because this is all about being brighter, being the light of the world, and being that light to other people who are in darkness. And these are my things I think that will make it happen and make it work and make it be fruitful. Number one is pray. Obviously, we've said all along, prayer undergirds everything that we do. So not only praying for the right people to invite or the right people to connect with, praying for them to come to faith, praying for them to have open hearts. That's number one. Number two is practice. You'll notice these all begin with P, Jen. Can't help it, I'm afraid. So number two is practice. Practice telling your story.
Yeah.
Practice using the 4 points or whatever means you want to use to explain the good news.
I think that's a really good one, Nick, isn't it? It's one of the reasons why we do this together, isn't it? With friends and communities in church, so that you've got people to practice on.
Absolutely, yeah. So hopefully some of the practice that you've had on this course has got you kick-started, but you're going to need to practice this again, week after week after. When you've been practicing for 6 months, I think it will be natural to you. So don't stop too soon. So the third thing is pray again. But I would say pray in your small groups, in your communities. Okay. Pray as a church. Because when we are praying together, there's that sort of extra dimension of prayer which is added. And that leads neatly to the fourth P, which is peer accountability.
Okay, what do you mean by that?
Okay, so accountability is actually the one thing that will change this from a one-off course that you've attended or been part of to a lifestyle that changes the landscape around you and changes the way you live. Being accountable to that group that you've started to pray with, to say to them, look, I'm praying for these 3 people at the moment. Would you please ask me, have I continued to pray? Would you please ask me, have I taken a next step? Have I asked the what's next, Lord question? And just having that as part of the regular rhythm of your small groups, or maybe just an informal group of friends who you meet up with from time to time. So look, every time we meet, let's be accountable to one another, peer accountability for actually doing this stuff, putting it into practice and trusting that God is going to work through our prayers and through our joint efforts. That's number 4.
Okay.
Number 5, final P, is to actually persist or persevere. None of this is an overnight thing. It's all to do with persevering, keeping going, not giving up. Because if you do these things, if you pray with your friends, if you practice all of these tools and simple ways of sharing good news, if you make yourself accountable to a peer group and you persevere, I guarantee you will see God work in the lives of those around you. You will become increasingly confident to be, do, and say good news where you live, learn, work, or play, and you will see fruit, and you will have great joy in your life as a result. God bless you.